to the All Around Adventure Podcast, the show where you hear amazing tales from afar and the all-important life lessons that go along with them. Here's your host, Josh Guerrero.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? It is Josh Guerrero here, and welcome to the All Around Adventure Podcast. Whether you're joining me for the first time or you've been listening to the podcast for a while now, I certainly do want to welcome you here. And as always, I want to thank you for being here today. I know you're busy. I know you have a lot going on, and I also know that there's a lot out there on the internet these days that's trying to get your attention, but it just means so much to me that you've chosen to download and listen to this podcast. Now, if you are in fact new to this podcast and you're not entirely sure what we're all about here, this is the show where you hear amazing tales from afar and get the all-important life lessons that go along with them. Those will be stories from myself as well as the amazing guests that I welcome on this podcast. But in this episode, you just have me today. This is a solo cast. I don't really have a fancy name for these solo casts like I used to in the past. This is just simply the solo show, I suppose I'll say. And I got my own story that I want to share with you all today, something cool that I did recently that I think you all might find interesting. And so with that, let's go ahead and get right on into today's episode. Now, recently, I got to take part in my very first paranormal investigation, and I did this at the Black Swan Inn in San Antonio, Texas. And I know we're outside of spooky season now, Halloween's over, and we're rolling into December, but I had to share this story because, again, I thought it was just so cool, and I like spooky stuff, and this is my show, so we're talking about it today. All right, so at the Black Swan Inn, there was an event hosted by the Paranormal Research Society and its founder, Ryan Buell. Now, the Paranormal Research Society and Ryan Buell, they had a show back in the early 2000s called Paranormal State. And this is when he was a student at Penn State. And him and some of his classmates that made up the Paranormal Research Society, they would go to different people's homes that were haunted and do investigations and try to see how they may help the people living there with their situation. And each episode of Paranormal State covered a different case, a different location, different haunting, and just what they were doing to try to, help the families based on what they discovered during their investigations. And really interesting show. I definitely seen a couple of episodes and certainly took interest from that. And of course, I really had to capitalize on the opportunity once I found out that he was going to be conducting this event in San Antonio, Texas. So this is what happened. And we began the night with a quick tour of the Black Swan Inn. And I won't really get too much into the history of the property. I'm certainly not a historian for the place, but I'm just going to tell you how the night went. And so we started off, we took a tour of the grounds, took a look at some of the locations that we're going to be conducting investigations in later that night. And after the tour, we gathered in the main house, or I like to think of it as a manor. That's more or less what it was. And we were in the main room in the manor, and he had a projector ready to go, and he just told us about some of his experiences with the paranormal, beginning when he was a kid and some of the hauntings that he experienced as a child, and then moving on to when he started investigating, going into some of the most wild cases that he's done while filming Paranormal State and outside of the show just as well too. And some of the stuff that he talked about was really, really creepy, just creatures in the night, demonic possession for some of the people that he was trying to help in some of the cases. And we even saw some footage of some exorcisms taking place. It was really, really interesting. And we talked about some of the methods for conducting paranormal investigations that we were going to try later that night. And it was really fascinating. And it was definitely really cool to hear some of his stories. So now moving into the investigation itself, what we did is we split into two different teams, and we were going to investigate two main areas on the property. So the way we did it was that one group would go investigate one area and the other group the other. And after about 30 to 40 minutes or so, we would switch places and conduct investigations in the other area. And then we would just try to see what each other experienced in each spot after the fact. And then we did something called Estes method, which I will get to here in a minute. So my group, we went to go investigate an area on the property called the barn first. And for me, the barn was pretty uneventful. I didn't really experience anything. And I'll just kind of caveat it with this. I actually didn't see anything. I didn't see any ghosts, apparitions, or anything like that. But I certainly did have some experiences as the night went on. However, I didn't experience anything myself, at least in the barn. However, there were a few in my group that did experience some things, and it was mostly just the women in my group. And there was about 7 women in my group, and then maybe about 3 men, counting myself. I may have those numbers slightly off, but the women in my group really felt like as if there was just this heavy feeling while they were inside the barn. And there was a couple of people there that have done investigations before, so they were a little bit more prepared when it came to using equipment for our investigation. There was one woman who had an app on her phone that was supposed to collect like electromagnetic frequencies. I'm still a little bit fuzzy on some of the science behind paranormal investigating, but there's a thing called electronic voice phenomenon, or EVPs. Basically, from how I understand this, and any paranormal investigators listening right now, do feel free to correct me on this. But I suppose the way it works is that spirits operate on a different electromagnetic frequency. And of course, we can't hear them audibly or anything like that. But electronic devices like voice recorders, video cameras, or I guess smartphones, if you have a recording app, can detect those a lot better. And so one of the women in my group, she had an app on her phone that was supposed to collect these frequencies if ghosts were responding to our questions, and actually like transcribe them into actual words and display them on the phone. So we would just try to ask questions and see what kind of responses we got. And there was also like a couple of other devices that had like a series of lights that if they detected electromagnetic frequencies, they would flash lights and everything. And you could say, like, as a response to a question, flash the lights twice for yes, 1 for no. And we just went about asking some questions. And some of the women did start feeling very uneasy. And there was a spirit that made itself known to us. And he said his name was George. And I think George kind of wasn't too pleased with the women that were in the barn that night in my group. And a lot of the women were describing that they just felt like someone was watching them, like looking over them. And the woman that was leading my group, she was a psychic. And she said that, yeah, George is trying to feel big around the women, trying to intimidate the women and look down on them. And that was certainly something that they were all describing. And I didn't experience anything myself. Like George wasn't trying to feel big over me, at least not from what I could tell or by anything I experienced. But all the women in the group were just claiming they just had this very uneasy feeling once we got some responses from George on the electronic devices that we were using. So that really pretty much just sums up my time in the barn. So nothing very much in the way of what I would call eventful for me personally, but certainly eventful for the women in my group. Now, the next location we went to do more investigating was inside the main house, the manor, in a room called the Seance Room. And there was a table in the center of the room. We all sat around it. At first, we started by joining hands like an actual seance, but eventually we just kind of just sat there because the device with the app, the phone with the app that was translating responses into words, we got a question that said, "Is this a ritual?" And probably as an indication that maybe the spirits didn't like that we were trying to conduct a ritual in their presence. And so we decided to sort of forego the ritual idea and just try to have a conversation, try to show that we didn't mean any disrespect. Now, in the seance room, this is where I started experiencing some things. It didn't take very long into asking questions to any spirits that might be present till a big feeling of cold started enveloping the room. And that's kind of sort of the cliche thing with ghosts. Like if anyone who's ever watched the show Supernatural, as soon as ghosts get close, the room tends to get very, very cold. And that's exactly what I experienced. And at first I thought maybe it was just me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me that I started feeling cold. But then everyone in my group, pretty much at the same time, almost in unison, were talking about how cold the room felt to them. So I wasn't the only one that started feeling cold as we were trying to communicate with the spirits in this room. And then later on, I felt another sensation. And this one came in the form of an intense tingling sensation on my face, on my shoulders, and on my upper arms. And again, maybe I thought it was just me. But then everyone else that was sitting around the table with me, they all described a similar feeling that they were experiencing. Now, the session in the seance room lasted about 45 minutes. And so I can't recall all the questions that were asked to the spirits, but there was one in particular that really stood out to me that actually gave me some chills. And it also elicited quite a response from everyone else that was around the table with me just as well. One of the responses we got from a spirit was, "Find my body." And I just asked plainly, "Where are you buried?" And the response that came back on the device after I asked that question was, "Cabinet." So I'm thinking to myself, was this person murdered and shoved in a cabinet somewhere? Definitely really, really chilling. So even though I didn't experience very much in the barn, which I was told the barn was kind of a hot spot for paranormal activity, maybe I was a little bit disappointed, I suppose, that I didn't experience anything. But my time in the seance room certainly made up for that, because I experienced quite a bit. And just as we were even wrapping up our session, here came another wave of cold that we all just started feeling once more. So after we finished up investigating the seance room and the other group finished investigating in the barn, we came back to the main room in the manor where we had the presentation earlier, and then we moved on to what was called Estes method. Now, the way that this worked is that one participant was going to a different room, and then we had a camera that was feeding live to a tablet in the main room. And each participant who took part in Estes method, they would wear noise-canceling headphones and a blindfold, and the headphones were attached to what was called a spirit box. And the spirit box was collecting a lot of radio waves and kind of sort of sifting through them. And once again, if like the ghosts were to be trying to communicate with us, the spirit box should be able to pick them up and transcribe what they were saying into actual words that can be heard through the headphones. And the way it's supposed to work is that the people who are observing ask the questions, and whoever's wearing the headphones and the goggles, they can't hear what they're asking, but they're just trying to say aloud any words that they hear come through the headphones. And then, of course, it would be determined as to whether or not, like, what that person was hearing in the headphones and what they were saying aloud correlates in any sort of way to the questions being asked. And I chose to be one of the participants who put on the noise-canceling headphones and goggles. And I was just, again, saying what it was, whatever I've heard out loud. And it was a little bit overwhelming because this thing sounded like it was scanning through a bunch of radio frequencies at a very, very like high rate. And it was a little bit overwhelming. And but Ryan, he came and he just said, yeah, that's the way they're supposed to sound. Just try to relax and just whatever comes to you, just say it aloud. And so once again, I don't know what questions everyone else was asking, but I did hear a couple of rather interesting words that I did say out loud. One of them was bloodlines, and another one was poison. And I don't know if that was answering a question that someone had asked, but that's just what I've heard. And I only got a few words that I heard during my time there. I did it for maybe about 12 minutes, but the sensory deprivation made it only feel like just a couple. But some of the other participants, they heard a lot more. And it was certainly pretty interesting. Now, before we left that night, we had to do kind of sort of, I don't know, I guess a ritual of sorts, I guess I'll say. And is that we had to tell any spirits in the home that they're to remain there, that none of them are to follow us home. Because I think I would probably have a hard time sleeping that night if I got the inkling that a spirit from that house followed me home and started haunting my own dwelling. So that was my first paranormal investigation. It's definitely a very interesting time. I certainly think I would like to do it again. And should you ever visit San Antonio, Texas someday, do check out the Black Swan Inn. Maybe you'll experience something there yourself. All right, everyone. That's it for today's episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did like today's episode, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast, wherever you might be listening to it. We'll have more episodes coming down the line. Also, let me know what you think. You can connect with me on social media. I'm most active on Instagram, @allaroundadventure. That's just one word with no dashes. Other than that, I thank you very much for tuning in today. I will see you next week with a brand new episode featuring another fantastic guest, so be sure to check back in. Thank you very much, and I will see you all next time.
Thank you for listening to the All Around Adventure Podcast. For more information and resources, head over to allaroundadventure.com. Also, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast directory. And until next time, be safe, happy travels, and always move forward.